Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today's lecture for Natural Resource, we're going to talk about nutritional problems, both in developed countries and developing countries. We normally know quite a bit about developed countries because for the most people that are watching this, that's where we live, in developed countries. And we know that this might look fictional, but I'm sure some of you have probably seen a hamburger or, whatever you call it, quadruple decker, I guess is probably what that would be called, um, before in your life. Maybe you didn't eat one yourself, but you probably know people that could put one of these down. In the United States, we have nutritional problems around overeating, when we should be consuming more fruits and vegetables. We tend to consider, well, the onion and the tomato on here is the fruit and the vegetable that I need in my life. This is going to be a nutritional problem, and it's not going away. It's actually becoming much more severe. There's lots of reasons for this. One reason, in my opinion, is uh, that's making this even worse has to do with the education that elementary school kids are getting when it comes to nutrition, and when it comes to things like sports and the usefulness of exercise and things like that. Um, I think they're not getting the education they should. And as that progresses, even into middle school and high school, we are doing away with a lot more athletic programs and nutritional programs and replacing them with other programs. Now, I'm not saying that those other programs are not needed, but we still need to provide individuals with healthy lifestyles. Because you might have the best job in the world and, straight out of 4-year college, make $250,000 a year, have a nice house, nice cars, and everything like that. But if you know nothing about the benefits of exercise and the benefits of eating right, um, you're not going to live to see yourself progress financially, regardless of the job. And so we'll look at these nutritional problems because it's not just our nutritional problems, but third world countries or developing countries have the opposite side of the spectrum, nutritional problems. Okay, so a lot of times when it comes to nutritional problems from a developing country point of view, it has to do with a lack of certain vitamins. So malnourishment or nutritional imbalance is caused by specific items, normally vitamins, being uh, absent from one's diet, or at least there's not enough in their diet. And that's not to say that individuals in the United States or developed countries can't be malnourished. You can definitely have malnourishment in the United States due to an imbalance, and it has nothing to do with food intake except for the wrong foods are being consumed. So it has really nothing to do with how many calories are being consumed, but rather what kind of materials are being consumed. So when we look at worldwide, remember the world population is about 7.7 billion and rising. About half of them, a little less than half of the people in the world, suffer from some kind of vitamin or mineral protein deficiency. I mean, that's a big deal. Even though these individuals might not be hungry, remember, it's only about 16% of the world's population are considered to have severe hunger or um, be subjected to a lack of food. About half of the world's population has some kind of deficiency when it comes to some part of their diet. And this can result in illnesses, death, autoimmune disorders, reduced immune function, reduced growth. A lot of times, maybe the malnourishment is only subjected to like overall growth of an individual, like bone density, height, these kind of things. Really, there's like estimates that the kind of the first 1,000 days of a human's life is that kind of tipping point. If you're missing vitamins and essential minerals and things like that in your diet the first 1,000 days of your life, then you can never make them up. You'll never make up that growth rate or that bone density, no matter what your diet switches to. So it basically causes stunted growth in some situations, or in other cases it can cause severe deformities as those individuals are trying to learn how to walk and crawl and things like that. It can cause lifelong deformities. And so malnourishment can be a really big deal when it comes to nutritional situations all over the world. Regardless of calorie intake, um, the lack of certain minerals and vitamins can be a huge problem. So probably iron deficiency is the most common dietary imbalance, and it happens a lot in the United States even. And so that can lead to anemia, which means that you have less hemoglobin in your red blood cells, which indicates often a breathing problem in the individual, so they're not able to take in as much oxygen with every breath. So you can get anemia and asthma forming at the exact same time, and or you can be anemic, which means that when it comes to things like high altitudes, that individual is poorly suited for environments that have low oxygen levels. Lots of things like that. And the other thing that it can cause is if you have severe anemia and you get bumps and bruises and cuts, it can cause hemorrhages, and it can cause the individual to die. And this often happens in other countries, developing countries, during childbirth. So if the mother doesn't have enough iron or is iron deficient and she gives birth, then a lot of times the mother will bleed out or have difficulties during that birthing process. Another one that occurs in a lot of Asian countries and in parts of India is the lack of iodine in one's diet. You might not think much about iodine. It's an element. It's found in quite a few different foods, but if you don't have iodine, it's needed for a cognitive connection in the brain, and it's also needed for the thyroid. And so what you can have is big like gourds or big swollen regions, okay, normally around the thyroid, but also around any other places where you're going to produce hormones. You can have these big swollen areas. It can stunt your growth, and it also can cause a decrease in mental capacity. Vitamin A is another one that a lot of individuals in Africa are missing, and this can cause blindness, and about 140 million children are missing this. So again, a lot of these nutritional problems come at that first kind of 1,000 days of life. Those are the ones that are most important. A lot of these are a lot of these nutritions or a lot of these nutrients and vitamins and things like that are passed on through breast milk. But where, vitamin A or something like that might not affect, lack of vitamin A might not affect the mother, it will affect her offspring. It will affect, her children, especially young in life. So there's a few disorders or diseases that are due to deficiencies in different things. For protein deficiencies, we see this a lot in African countries. We have Kwashiorkor disease, which we often call a displaced child disease, where basically, most of you have probably seen pictures of this, where the stomach is bloated and the rest of the body is very, very skinny and sometimes discolored. Sometimes this can look like, can't remember the name. Man, I can't remember the name. It'll come to me later. But anyways, there's other disorders where you can have, again, low protein, or that's coupled with low calorie intake. So marsh is the waste away disease. Often this will be both a bloated stomach, but you can also see very thin, and the skin will often be kind of loose in regions, meaning that the skin's there for more body mass, but the muscles have been deteriorated, and the body's actually consuming the muscle to provide enough nutrients to run the organs of the individual. So here you can see marsh, not a huge bloat on this individual's stomach, but you can definitely see, it's never good to be able to see all the ribs, but it's also not, it's really bad to be able to see the sternum connection. Okay, and there's goiter. Okay, you can see that swollen thyroid gland, and this is due to a lack of iodine in the diet. This is due mainly to a lack of calories. You can see this woman's arm here, probably the mother to this child, my guess is, but you can see the deterioration of the muscle in the woman. Very malnourished individuals. So there are some key food sources in the world. There's three main crops worldwide that the majority of nutrients and nutrition comes for humanity, and that's wheat, rice, and corn. Now, in some cases, these are used to feed protein sources in some countries and really not readily eaten. But in other cases, this is the staple diet, is either wheat, rice, or corn, or all three in some cases. So we look at the overall production, about 2 billion metric tons is grown each year. And of course, there's other staple products, staple food sources, depending on the environment. And the nice thing about wheat, rice, and corn is one of these three items will probably grow almost every place in the world. I have, especially with genetically modified organisms, corn can grow and wheat can grow in really cold environments now. And so a lot of these can be grown in many different regions of the world. But in some regions, that's not possible to grow these, so you'll see some of these additional food sources, take the place of these. Things like potatoes, which are grown often in high altitude regions, in like South America and things like that. Barley, oats, rye. These are cool climates, moist climates, often hillside climates. You can grow a lot of these things on those regions or in those regions. Oops, sorry. And then on hot environments with moisture, cassava is a plant, probably the staple food plant for Africa and parts of India. But you have other rooting or tuber plants like sweet potatoes and potatoes for that matter that can be found in warm, wet climates. Now, we notice that there's a lot of situations where you have diseases or disorders that can result from a lack of protein. And we know that meat production, is the best source of protein. And so most countries know this, most people know this, and a lot of areas are trying to take advantage of this. And you can see this by looking at this. When we look at developed countries, the meat consumption in a developed country in 1960 was about 10 kilograms per person per year, and now it's up to 26 kilograms per person per year. So that probably increases it definitely increases the protein intake, but it probably increases the health of individuals. Now, the further this goes, the further it tips the scale, the worse it is for a population when it comes to obesity and other health issues. So if we look at the United States, in 1960, people in the United States were consuming about 90 kilograms per person per year. And now we're at about 136 kilograms per person per year in the same time interval as the rest of the developed countries. I mean, look at that. We are consuming over 100 kilograms more per person per year than another developed country in meat consumption. So it's no wonder that we might have issues with obesity and people being overweight. We overeat meat by a lot. And I'll show you some more examples of this. Okay, so meat, we know though, is very high concentration of protein, has good iron, so you're not iron deficient, has plenty of fats and other nutritional value. This is true. However, it also has a huge amount of calories. And so the caloric intake from meat products is gigantic. But nonetheless, when we look at meat and the production of meat and the consumption of meat for that matter, you can basically put on a scale, if the higher the meat production and consumption of meat, the higher the wealth of that country is. Okay? Because meat is very expensive to make. It takes more than 8 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of beef. Beef is pretty close to the worst conversion you could possibly have. From grain to beef is a horrible conversion. From grain to grain, it's a 1-to-1 conversion. That should make sense to you, that each kernel of grain results in a kernel of food. Now, from grain to fish, it's about a 1.5 conversion. Chickens is, for every 2 grains, you get 1 grain of chicken. Okay? And on and on and on. And you look at beef, it's a 1-to-8 conversion. A really bad conversion when you look at the overall kilograms produced. And by and large, for sure, in the United States, the number 1 meat source that we consume is beef. Okay? And everyone else is far down the line in second, third, fourth place. I mean, probably 10 times at least the amount of beef is consumed rather than pork, chicken, fish. So what's allowed us to ramp up these food resources, often what we call CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations. These are gigantic food lots, or feedlots, what some people call them. And these are areas at which we can house large amounts of organisms and feed them all at the same time, typically soybean diet or corn diet or both, maybe some wheat mixed in depending on the CAFO and what organism we're talking about. And this increases their growth. And we can grow meat from, birth to production in less than a year. And in some cases, maybe a month or two, depending on the meat product that we're talking about. This is very common in the United States. We're the leader in CAFOs by far, but Europe and China have also picked up their production of meat in this way. The other thing that we start to see is we start to see new breeds being formed. In some cases, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, or genetically selected organisms to get from, basically birth to production to meat produced in the shortest time possible. It's reasonable. The other thing that is often supplied at CAFOs or feedlots is an increase in antibiotics that is provided for the organisms. Because first of all, these organisms, a lot of them are genetically similar, so there's not a lot of genetic differences, so that means their immune systems are all pretty close to the same, and that means if you get one disease that goes through, you could lose the entire feedlot. And this has happened with like mad cow disease and things like that. We've had the entire feedlot being affected with diseases like that. But the other thing it does is by increasing the amount of antibiotics, you decrease the amount of energy needed for immune system. So you don't get the disease spread, and on top of it, that increase in energetics that you save can go right into the production of meat, or eggs, or whatever, milk, whatever the production is. Most of the time we're talking about CAFOs, we're talking about meat production, but we can also talk about other types of production, whether it comes from eggs and milk and these other productions where you have these large organizations of animals in the same region, nearly identical in genetics, getting fed massive amounts of antibiotics to prevent disease outbreaks. Now, when we look at energetics, we can also look at the energy that's needed to be utilized to run these organizations to produce the food, to produce the kilogram of meat. You need about 16 times the amount of fossil fuel to produce 1 kilogram of meat. And so that's how much energy it needs compared to 1 kilogram of plant. So if we're growing tomatoes in a greenhouse, with all the lights and water that's utilized, it's 16 times less energy than 1 kilogram of beef on a feedlot. And that's the energy intensity of protein production or meat production. When we look at what has been projected by the UN and some other agriculture organizations, it's suggested that 20% of the world's greenhouse gases come from livestock production. That's huge. It's a huge amount of greenhouse gases that are coming in from this industry. Now, this might blow your mind, but this has been produced by many organizations, UN Food, WHO, agriculture organizations, when we look at the amount of fossil fuel it takes to make meat products, especially beef, if you were to consume 1/5 of the beef that you intake, you would reduce your energetic cost more than if you bought a hybrid car. Okay? And many of you might be like, well, it depends on the hybrid car, right? Yeah, it does depend on the hybrid car, but in general, it also depends on the meat that you eat. But in general, if you were to just reduce the amount of meat by 1/5, you would reduce your ecological footprint on the planet more than buying a hybrid car. Okay? The other thing is if you look at how much food, how much meat the average American intakes, right? We intake about 200 pounds, a little bit over on average. The average American eats 200 pounds of meat. Okay? And by and large, it's beef. Okay? 200 pounds of meat every year. That amounts to about 66 burgers. Now, I know that most people don't eat 66 hamburgers in a month, okay? But this includes turkey and ground beef and steak, okay, and ribs and all that other material, beef or meat that we eat. It amounts to about 66 quarter pounders per month, okay? Because we consume about 2 pounds a day of meat product. If you were to cut that by 1/5, you'd be consuming about 13 burgers per month, and reduce your ecological footprint by more than going out and buying a hybrid car. That's the United States and parts of Europe, where majority of the meat consumed is red meat or poultry. Pretty much the rest of the world, it's seafood. So when we look at seafood in general, the protein from seafood is the staple. I mean, we're talking in some regions about 1.5 billion people. It's their only protein source is coming from seafood. And this is hugely important for developing countries. So developing countries, far more than developed countries, consume seafood as their main protein source. Well, this has taken a major toll on the world's fisheries. Since 1989, almost every single fishery that we have, whether we're talking about salmon, whether we're talking about halibut, whether we're talking about cod, which is almost all gone, pollock, haddock, tuna, you name it, even shellfish and the invertebrates that we eat, lobster and crab, almost every single one of them is unsustainable and on a major decline. Most predictions suggest that by 2050, every single seafood that you currently could buy at a grocery store. So you go to a normal grocery store, go to the seafood section, all of those are gone by 2050. Okay? Completely gone, exhausted, no more production, and majority of those species will be extinct. That's how severe the problem is. Apart from just the overall take, you have bycatch issues where turtles and birds and other species that shouldn't be taken out, like sharks and dolphins and other species, aquatic mammals and things like that are taken via bycatch, are also having an effect from the fishing practices that we currently utilize today, which is basically a very large boat with a very large net behind it. And when I'm talking very large net, I'm talking a net that is big enough that you could fit 3, 4 747s, giant airplanes inside the net and still have room. And we're talking massive nets that can be pulled through the water to catch pretty much everything that's in that water source. So we've switched. A lot of countries realize that fishing wild species, fishing wild fish species is not the answer, and we'll never be able to do this and supply food resources to developing countries and the developed countries for that matter. So a lot of countries are switching to aquaculture or growing species of fish and other things in confined areas just like feedlots to increase the world's seafood production. There are major problems with this, and that is just like feedlots or CAFOs, you have the same issue, except for when you're looking at aquaculture supplies, sometimes it's the wild populations that we're bringing in to grow. Other times it's the wild populations of smaller organisms, okay, krill, shrimp, these kind of things that we're capturing to feed the populations of fish that we keep in these pens. So you're just taking from the environment to feed. It's kind of a similar problem that we have in CAFOs where you're growing massive amounts of corn and soybean and things like that just to feed the livestock. So you're damaging the land off of the CAFOs so you're damaging the land off of the CAFO to support the CAFO. Okay? And that's exactly what we see in aquaculture systems also. Apart from that, most of these occur as close to the coast as possible. So coral reefs, mangroves, these kind of things are all being dredged up, cut down, and you're blocking off little sections of the oceanic region so that you can grow seafood. So you get a lot of damage to the terrestrial environment around, but also the semi-terrestrial environment, these transitional species that occur in those regions. Of course, just like the concern is with feedlots, is that you can spread disease. You can spread disease within the aquaculture system, but because these are not closed systems and the water is flowing through these systems, you could also spread disease and parasites and things like that to the native fish in the nearby water. The other thing is just like in feedlots, you increase the amount of fecal material, you increase the amount of antibiotics, you increase the other pollutants that are going into the water system. These are going directly into the water system. When it comes to feedlots, that has to come through runoff, but it almost always does, because if it rains, it's running off into the nearby streams and things like that. Here, it's going directly into the water source. And with that, we will talk about, well, what can be done if feedlots are not the answer, if aquaculture is not the answer, if mass production of 3 main species, wheat, rice, and corn, is not the answer because of the amount of pesticides and herbicides and the amount of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that you have to add back to the landscape to raise these crops on the landscape. What's the answer? What's the possible answer to decrease that food shortage even further? Again, 600 million people are dying from starvation or will probably die from starvation. Okay? So again, 7.7 billion, 600 million, so you pretty much take a little piece of that away, and those individuals are going to die of starvation. Apart from that, malnourishment, nutrient deficiency, etc., about half the world's population is in some kind of form of nutrient deficiency. So what can we do? Okay? That's next time.